We begin today's daily debrief with a developing story. Right now, Florida is bracing for Hurricane Milton, which is now a Category 5 storm. The state is still reeling from devastation and destruction caused less than 2 weeks ago by Hurricane Helene. We will have an update on Milton in later, but first, we are just 29 days away from Election Day. And the polls continue to show a razor-thin race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, the candidates making headlines over the weekend. The popular Call Her Daddy podcast dropped a surprise episode with Vice President Harris.
The American people are voting for freedom because ultimately it's about, look, this is not about imposing my thoughts on you in terms of what you do with your life or your body. It's actually quite the opposite. It's saying the government shouldn't be telling people what to do.
And former President Trump campaigned in Butler, Pennsylvania for the first time since the July assassination attempt, bringing billionaire Elon Musk on stage to cast a dire warning ahead of the upcoming election.
Register to vote. Okay? And get everyone you know and everyone you don't know, drag them to register to vote. If they don't, this will be the last election. That's my prediction.
Joining me now is the Hill's Brett Samuels with the latest from the campaign trail and around Washington. Brett, as always, it's good to see you. Look, I want to go to that Call Her Daddy podcast where Kamala Harris responded to Arkansas Governor Sarah Huckabee-Sanders, who essentially said, or implied that Harris wasn't humble because she didn't have her own biological children. What effect is Harris's response to that question going to have with voters?
Yeah, certainly. I think, we were talking a little bit before this, how, going on the Call Her Daddy podcast, obviously something different for Vice President Harris. She's reaching a different audience with this podcast. And certainly her response to Sarah Sanders' comments, I think, maybe the most notable answer that came out of this appearance on that podcast. So obviously the Sarah Sanders comments, which you mentioned, in which she implied that Vice President Harris had nothing keeping her humble because she didn't have children in her life. Those came on the heels, of course, of J.D. Vance and his childless cat lady comments causing a stir. So certainly those Sarah Sanders comments made headlines. And now we have Vice President Harris sort of responding to those pretty directly, saying, that this isn't the 1950s, that women should not be defined by, their role in a family or whether they have children, that families take on all different shapes and forms now, that she's not striving or aspiring to be humble. That shouldn't be the goal of women in public life. So certainly a very notable response from Vice President Harris, hitting back at a pretty prominent criticism, and I think a sign also that that she'd be asked about this on this podcast is a sign that those kinds of comments from Sarah Sanders, from J.D. Vance, clearly broke through to an electorate beyond just sort of the Washington, D.C. bubble.
So, Brett, I want to move over to the Trump side of things. Elon Musk appeared on stage for the first time campaigning with Trump and warned that this could be the last election. President Biden said last week he doesn't know if this election or the outcome of the election will be peaceful. Both sides are sounding so alarming right now. Why?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of hyperbolic rhetoric about what's at stake in this election. Certainly, Democrats have for years been warning that former President Trump is this grave threat to democracy, that they fear if he wins a second term, that he'll, prosecute his enemies, erode institutions, and Democrats have, essentially sounded the alarm that democracy itself could be at risk if Trump wins. Now you have Trump and his allies sort of trying to make the same argument about Democrats you heard Elon Musk, as you mentioned, on this rally stage. Certainly very notable that he was on stage there. This is sort of the most explicitly political, I think, that he's been, even since endorsing Donald Trump in July, where, he's warning that this could be the last election if Democrats win. Donald Trump has tried to paint Democrats as this threat to democracy. His argument has basically been, that they replaced Joe Biden atop the ticket, that's undemocratic, that they're the ones who are a threat to democracy. So certainly, as you said, both sides kind of exchanging these dire warnings, certainly in a bid to, I think, motivate their voters to get out there and create this sense of urgency to vote in November. But at the same time, the question is whether that message kind of wears thin on people, whether they're kind of tired of hearing this sort of alarmist rhetoric.
So today also marks the one-year anniversary since the October 7th terror attack on Israel. This attack has changed the world, changed the Middle East. We are now seeing much of the Middle East seemingly on the brink of an all-out regional war. But it's also impacted our politics here at home in Washington, across the country. How has it impacted the political landscape?
Yeah, certainly. It's been, for the past year, it's really been, if not front and center, just off to the center in pretty much all the discourse, all the policy discussions, all the political discussions. On the one hand, you have Congress, where there's been talk of, how much to fund Israel, how much to send Israel military support. On the Democratic side, as far as President Biden and the White House race goes, President Biden, since this war began, really, or shortly thereafter, he has faced this really sort of difficult battle within his own party over how much to support Israel, over whether or not he's done enough to, essentially influence Israel's behavior or curtail kind of their military campaign in Gaza, where tens of thousands of Palestinians have died. Certainly we've seen, these sort of uncommitted voter movements or abandon Biden, abandon Harris movements of voters who are trying to essentially influence the Democratic ticket as far as their approach to Israel. Those movements have come out and they've said that they won't endorse Vice President Harris, or that they're endorsing a third-party candidate. So certainly that's been at play there. And then on the Republican side, former President Trump has really tried to make this an issue where he's just been on the attack all the time, not just against Democrats, but we've seen him get into trouble because he's also sort of argued that Jewish voters who don't support him, that they should have their heads examined, quote unquote, as Trump has said. And building off that, as you talked about, this really sort of dominated our politics. There's been this spike in anti-Semitism, certainly, that we've seen in the past year following those attacks on Israel. So it really, as you said, it's sort of been borderline all-consuming in how those October 7th attacks a year ago really sort of transformed the political landscape.
So on that note about Arab American voters and also Jewish American voters, a big population of Arab American voters, for example, in Michigan, much of the Midwest, but also a large population of Jewish American voters in New York, where there's a number of contentious House races happening. Do you see this conflict, impacting turnout or results in the election?
Yeah, certainly there are indications that it very well could. As I mentioned, you have this uncommitted voter movement that played a big role in the primaries and sort of getting folks to write in these protest votes against President Biden. That movement now shifting over to Vice President Harris has said that it's not going to endorse a candidate. It didn't endorse Vice President Harris, but it said, that it couldn't support endorsing Trump or encouraging voters to back Trump. You have this separate abandon Harris movement of Arab American voters who have come out and said that they're backing Jill Stein, the third party candidate. So it'll be interesting to see how much bearing that has. But I think that's a sign, certainly, that there is a block of voters who are certainly concerned enough about the White House's support for Israel, given what's happening in Gaza, that they're trying to nudge some folks away from backing the Democratic ticket. And certainly, as you mentioned, Jewish American voters are also going to play a big role in this election, both in swing states and down ballot races. Certainly Jewish voters are not a monolith. Not every Jewish voter believes that support for Israel is sort of a benchmark for them in their support. But that's sort of how former President Trump has presented it. This idea that he's such a pro-Israel president in his first term, that Jewish American voters should then back him. We've seen President Biden and Vice President Harris say that their support for Israel is unwavering, while also calling for more humanitarian aid into Gaza. So certainly it'll be, I think, as you said, there's still a lot going on in the Middle East, a lot of tensions there. I'm sure this will be something we'll continue to hear about in this last few weeks before the election.
And speaking of a critical voting bloc in the Midwest, but I guess this one is also in Pennsylvania, I want to talk about the union voters. One of the biggest challenges that have emerged for Kamala Harris is the lack of support from these unionized blue-collar working voters in states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. We know that she's leading in a number of those states, but in some of these polls, there seems to be some vulnerability there. We know that a number of, few notable unions like the Teamsters, for example, have not endorsed. They normally do. How much is she underperforming with this group compared to Biden, who has such a close relationship with the unions in this country?
Yeah, certainly. So, what the Harris campaign would argue is that she may be underperforming what President Biden had done, but she's still ahead of Trump as far as union voters. There was a Fox News poll a couple months back that showed her up something like 30 points among union households. And that was right around the time she became the nominee. And certainly since then, as you mentioned, the Teamsters Union opted not to endorse a candidate. We've seen a lot of local Teamsters chapters come out and endorse Vice President Harris to sort of show their support. The Firefighters Union, another big one, just last week said that they were not endorsing a candidate in this race. And the Firefighters Union endorsed President Biden in 2019. So, a full year before he was even the Democratic candidate in the 2020 race. So that was a notable one, too. I think that they wouldn't go ahead and endorse Vice President Harris. So I think those are certainly some warning signs that folks are looking at, this idea that even though Vice President Harris is sort of following in line with President Biden's policies as far as union workers, working class voters, some of them are just not quite convinced yet. They're still a little unsure about her policies, about her track record. So certainly in a state like Michigan, where there's a lot of unionized workers, Pennsylvania, a lot of working class voters, and the margins are going to be really tight. It could make a difference, certainly, if Vice President Harris can't quite match those margins that President Biden was able to put up in 2020.
I want to switch gears finally a little bit and focus on the hurricane response. We opened the show talking about Milton, which, as of this recording, has been a Category 5 storm barreling towards the west coast of Florida. But, going back to Hurricane Helene, which, tore through much of the west coast of Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, we're still seeing political responses from that, the federal government's response. We know that Trump himself has, made this political. Here's what he had to say over the weekend about Helene's response.
People are dying. Like 500 people are missing. It's a disaster. The federal government the White House is doing nothing. They've abandoned us. And it's largely a Republican area. So some people say they did it for that reason.
So it's interesting, Brett, because I've actually heard a number of Republican governors praising the federal government, the Biden administration, for its response. So what is Trump referring to, and are other Republicans agreeing with him?
Yeah, certainly former President Trump has, I think it's fair to say, made this hurricane response fairly political. He's really gone after the Biden administration. He's made these claims that the Biden administration is less interested in helping Republican hit areas. He's made these claims that FEMA, for example, they have no money for disaster relief because they spent it all on assisting migrants with housing. And we've seen other Republicans, as you mentioned, sort of echo a lot of these claims, really attack the Biden administration, say that FEMA has not prioritized the response or that they've been slow moving. And the fact is, the White House has really had to aggressively push back on this. They've, pointed out that FEMA has separate sort of allocations for funding for assisting migrants versus disaster relief, that those are not coming from the same pot. Certainly, as you mentioned, we've had Republican officials in Tennessee and North Carolina. Georgia Governor Brian Kemp came out and said that the federal government's been doing everything they've needed. We've seen newspaper headlines kind of pushing back on misinformation around the hurricane. So it's really been, I think, a notable aspect of this that we maybe haven't really seen before in a storm response, this idea that officials not just have to get information out about where those impacted can find resources, can find help, but they also have to push back on sort of these misconceptions that maybe their community is being left out for political reasons, or their community is not actually getting the support that the federal government says that they're putting out. So as another hurricane bears down in Florida, certainly something to watch if we see more of the same.
Right, and obviously those safety efforts, the response, obviously a first priority, but it is interesting to see every 4 years the collision of presidential politics and hurricane season. On that note, Brett Samuels, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Julia.
Now to the developing story we're watching in the Gulf of Mexico. Hurricane Milton has strengthened to a Category 5 in roughly 24 hours. The National Hurricane Center says Milton winds are nearly 160 miles per hour with higher gusts. The storm is expected to make landfall along Florida's Gulf Coast on Wednesday. The latest round of mass evacuations are taking shape as the state still recovers from Hurricane Helene. That storm ravaged the southeast and killed at least 200 people just 2 weeks ago. As many as 15 million people are now under flood watches across Florida. President Biden approved Florida's emergency declaration, which authorizes the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA to coordinate all disaster relief efforts. News Nation's Washington correspondent Joe Khalil takes a look at the growing scrutiny FEMA is facing ahead of Milton's arrival.
Julia, it is possible that FEMA has a serious budget shortfall. That's going to depend on what Hurricane Milton does. How serious is the storm? How major is its impact? That's why we're watching Milton so seriously. FEMA does have enough to cover the damage, the cleanup, and all of the personal aid from Hurricane Helene. But if there is a second storm with the weight that Milton might bring, that's where FEMA is going to run into problems. Take a look at its budgetary situation before both of these storms started. They were on track, FEMA was, to be in a $3 billion deficit by February of next year and a $22.5 billion deficit by September. Now, a lot of that was going toward recovery efforts from various natural disasters, paying back municipalities and states that have already responded to storms. Hurricane Milton could make this the sort of perfect storm scenario where FEMA would have to go back to Congress, have them come back in and approve more funding should they need it. Remember, Congress, before they left for their recess 2 weeks ago, they approved an additional $20 billion specifically for the Disaster Relief Fund for FEMA. So again, that money should cover Helene, but it may beyond that be short. The White House and FEMA both say that they are now laying the groundwork for Milton's impact, that resources in Florida and elsewhere are already on the ground. They've got staging that has already begun. They've got personnel in certain communities ready to support. So we're going to see what Milton does, and really a lot of the budget questions are going to rely on what happens there. We should mention there have been a number of rumors and claims that the reason FEMA is short on funds is because it's already spent significant money on migrants. Now, that claim is mostly false at this point. What we know is that FEMA has spent upwards of $1 billion on migrant services, paying back cities and towns that have taken migrants in. But that fund is an entirely separate pool of funding than the disaster money. So one does not necessarily impact the other. And when we talk about $1 billion, obviously that is a lot of money in taxpayer dollars, but it's not nearly the money that we spend on hurricane and disaster relief. Over the last few years, that's been upwards of $20 billion per year. So those rumors simply don't comport, though we have heard them time and again at this point, Julia.
And thank you to Joe Khalil. Meantime, polling shows the race is closer than ever, especially in 7 key swing states. News Nation's Blake Berman breaks down the numbers for us.
1 month to go and too close to call. I'm Blake Berman with News Nation. Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump both traveling across the 7 key swing states. On Friday, Harris in Michigan, Trump in Georgia and North Carolina. It is a razor-thin race across these 7 key states, all separated, as you can see here, by 2 points. That's according to the Hill Decision Desk Election Center polling average. Now, the blue wall, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, all favoring Harris. Nevada right there as well. The rest of the Sun Belt down in here, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, leaning toward Trump. It's a tight race on the issues as well. According to the Cook Political Report, voters favor Harris on protecting democracy, Social Security and Medicare, and abortion. They prefer Trump on the economy, immigration, and foreign policy. On inflation, the public is split. I'm Blake Berman, and this is the News Nation Political Minute.
Many Verizon customers venting their frustration on social media Monday morning after thousands of customers woke up to outages across the U.S. It's the second time in a week that the cell provider experienced a major outage, according to downdetector.com. New York City saw some of the most outage reports, mostly on mobile phones. Verizon says the issue has been resolved, but has not given a reason for the outage. And that's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.